At 11:57 Universal Time on the morning, the Orion capsule finally came home. The last radiation sensor on board recorded its final reading and then went silent. That reading was not the peak. The peak had come 6 days earlier, in the middle of the night by mission clock, when 4 astronauts were sleeping strapped to the walls of a spacecraft that was hurtling through a region of space no human had entered in 53 years. The reading was not the average either. The average had already told its story. What that final data point captured was something quieter and in some ways more disturbing. It captured the fact that for the entire outbound leg, the entire lunar flyby and the entire return coast, the instruments never once fell back to the baseline levels that the pre-mission models had promised. Not for an hour, not for a minute. The Artemis II crew did not fly through deep space. They lived inside it, and what they brought back is not what the press releases are telling you. This is the Cosmic Forecast, and if you are joining this channel for the first time, welcome. What you are about to hear is not a celebration. It is not a takedown either. It is a forensic accounting of what 4 human beings actually encountered on the first crewed lunar flight since 1972, why the numbers that came home with them do not fit the story we have been telling ourselves about Mars, and why several senior investigators, some still inside NASA, some retired and speaking more freely, are now using a phrase in private conversations that they would never use on camera. The phrase is, "We may have been wrong about this from the beginning, not wrong about the moon, wrong about what comes after." If this has you hooked, subscribe to the Cosmic Forecast so you do not miss what comes next, because this story is not over. It is just now beginning to hit the peer-reviewed data, and drop a comment below. I want to know where in the world you are watching this from, what time it is where you are, and your honest answer to this question. Given what Artemis II actually measured, not what it was supposed to measure, do you believe a human crew will stand on Martian soil in your lifetime? Or are we watching, in real time, the moment humanity quietly discovers that the wall between us and Mars is not engineering, not funding, not political will, but physics itself? Tell me. I read the comments, and on this one, the geography of the answers is going to matter. Now, settle in, because we are going to walk through this the way it deserves to be walked through. Slowly, precisely, with the actual numbers. There are 20 parts to what follows. Each one peels back one more layer. By the time we reach the end, you will understand exactly what the crew of Artemis II discovered, why the discovery cannot be undone, and why the phrase "step one toward Mars" may turn out to be one of the most misleading sentences of the 21st century. Part 1. The claim nobody at the press conference wanted to make. There is a moment during every crewed re-entry that nobody talks about at the post-flight briefings. It lasts approximately 6.5 minutes. And during those 6.5 minutes, the most advanced human-rated spacecraft ever constructed becomes, for all practical engineering purposes, an incandescent rock wrapped in a plasma cocoon that no radio signal on Earth can pierce. The Orion capsule carrying Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch and Jeremy Hansen slammed into Earth's upper atmosphere at approximately 4 kilometers per second. Translated into a unit your body actually understands, that is roughly 39,700 kilometers per hour, or about 24,700 miles per hour. It is Mach 32. 32 times the speed of sound in the air the rest of us are currently breathing. At that velocity, the air molecules directly in front of the capsule do not simply heat up, they ionize. The nitrogen and oxygen atoms are stripped of their electrons, forming a superheated plasma sheath that wraps the vehicle like a coat of liquid lightning. And that plasma does something operationally terrifying. It blocks every radio frequency in and out. No telemetry, no voice loop, no biometric data, no hand from Houston, mission control goes dark. The families in the visitor stands go quiet. And for 6.5 minutes, the entire planet has no idea whether 4 human beings are alive, dead, or somewhere in between. Let me say that again so it registers. 6.5 minutes of silence. Not because something failed, because that is what the physics of hypersonic re-entry does to electromagnetic waves in an ionized medium. We have known about this since the Mercury program in the early 1960s. We knew about it through Gemini, we knew about it through Apollo, and in the year of Artemis II, with all of the computational power humanity possesses, with all of our simulation capacity, with materials science that Wernher von Braun would have called magic, we still cannot speak to our own astronauts during the most lethal phase of their journey home. We just wait. Now here is the part that should stop you cold. Artemis II was marketed to the public as a triumph, and in the ways that matter to a public affairs office, it absolutely was. 4 astronauts flew a loop that carried them roughly 9,300 kilometers past the far side of the Moon, a distance of approximately 407,000 kilometers from Earth at maximum rate. That is farther than any human has been from home since December of 1972. That is a legitimate hard-won achievement. But the word that kept appearing in the post-mission technical briefings, the private ones, the ones the cameras did not sit in on, was not triumph. It was margin, as in we had less of it than we thought. And margin, in aerospace engineering, is not a compliment. Margin is the number of standard deviations between where the vehicle actually operated and where the vehicle would have failed. When engineers say the margin was thinner than expected, they are saying the safety envelope was smaller than the models predicted. They are saying we came closer to the wall than we intended to come. They are not saying we hit the wall, they are saying we saw the wall. What Artemis 2 demonstrated, if you look at the sensor data instead of the mission recap videos, is that human spaceflight beyond low Earth orbit is still balanced on an edge that no amount of hardware upgrade since Apollo has meaningfully widened. The heat shield had been rebuilt after unexplained material loss on the uncrewed test flight. The radiation environment ran above baseline for the entire deep space phase. A geomagnetic disturbance rolled through Earth's magnetosphere on the return leg, and the re-entry itself, that 11. 4 km per second plunge through a wall of plasma was the fastest crewed atmospheric entry in the history of the species. Let that sentence breathe for a second. In this year we performed the fastest crewed re-entry in human history. Not in 1969, not in 1972. This year, that should tell you something about where we actually stand, structurally, in the arc of human deep space capability. It should also tell you something about how much of that arc has been vertical and how much of it has been sideways. The stagnation temperature at the shoulder of the heat shield during that entry, based on preliminary thermocouple data released in a technical exchange briefing, peaked in the vicinity of 2,760 degrees Celsius. In Fahrenheit, that is right around 5,000 degrees. It is hot enough to boil iron. It is hotter than the surface of a red dwarf star. Standing between 4 human beings and that temperature was a layer of ablative material called avcoat, a substance engineered to erode in a controlled, mathematically predictable pattern, carrying thermal energy away from the vehicle as it burns off. It is a designed sacrifice. The shield destroys itself to keep the crew alive. It worked. And this is the part NASA was noticeably less eager to elaborate on in public. It worked in a configuration that had never before flown at lunar return velocity with a crew inside. We will come back to that. Circle it in your head for now. The point of part 1 is this. Artemis 2 succeeded. The crew is home. The capsule is in the recovery bay in Long Beach, being disassembled panel by panel, and the mission is already being framed by every space media outlet on Earth as the foundation for Artemis 3, the first crewed lunar landing since Apollo 17. And beyond that, for the long horizon goal that every space agency, every private space company, and every visionary keeps repeating, sometimes as a slogan, sometimes as a promise, sometimes as a fundraising pitch. Mars. And that is exactly why what I am about to walk you through matters. Because if Artemis 2 is the stepping stone, then we need to look very carefully at what it actually stepped on. Not what we hoped it stepped on, not what the headlines say it stepped on. What the physics, the biology, the dosimetry and the arithmetic say it stepped on. 53 years passed between Apollo 17 and Artemis 2, more than half a century. And in that time we did not solve the radiation problem. We did not solve the heat shield problem at Mars return velocities. We did not solve the closed-loop life support problem for multi-year durations. What we did was build a capsule that is marginally safer, substantially heavier, and dramatically more expensive than the one we flew to the moon in 9,972, and we sent it on a mission that was deliberately, carefully, almost surgically designed to minimize risk exposure at every possible point in the flight profile. That is not confidence, that is caution. And caution wearing the costume of confidence is not a stepping stone. It is an admission dressed up as an announcement. So here is the question that nobody at the agency, nobody in the congressional space subcommittees, and nobody at any of the private launch providers wants to answer with a straight face. If this is step 1, a 10-day flyby with no lunar orbit insertion, no docking, no lander, no surface stay, and a heat shield that had to be redesigned between flights and flown for the first time with humans aboard, what does step 10 look like? What does a 900-day round trip to Mars look like when we are barely holding on to a 10-day trip to the moon? Artemis 2 did not prove we are ready for Mars, it proved we are barely ready for the moon. And when you follow the numbers, not the timelines, not the keynote speeches, not the artist renderings of a red planet outpost with a domed atrium, but the actual numbers, what you find on the other side is something we are quietly, structurally, and increasingly obviously not ready to hear. Stay with me, because it gets sharper from here. Part 2. The mission profile that reads like a confession. The trajectory that Artemis 2 actually flew has a technical name in orbital mechanics. It is called a hybrid free return trajectory, and it is by design the safest crewed path you can plot to the vicinity of the moon and back. The concept is elegant to the point of being almost poetic. You launch the spacecraft on a heliocentric adjusted transfer orbit, aim the trajectory so that the moon's gravity well bends the flight path into an elongated figure-8 loop, and the vehicle swings back toward Earth without ever needing to relight its main engine. Gravity does the work. If every propulsion system on board failed simultaneously, every thruster, every reaction control jet, every attitude gimbal, the crew would still come home. The universe itself, mathematically, would bring them back. That is why they call it a free return. The physics is paying the fare. That sounds elegant, and it is, but it is also a confession. Think about what that trajectory actually means in operational terms. Orion never entered lunar orbit. It did not perform a lunar orbit insertion burn, which is one of the most computationally sensitive and failure-consequential maneuvers in the entire crewed spaceflight playbook. It did not rendezvous with any other vehicle. It did not dock with the Gateway station, because Gateway does not exist yet in a habitable form. It did not deploy a lander. It did not test long-duration habitation. It did not perform a surface abort simulation. It flew out, it flew around, it flew back. That was the mission. And the reason that was the mission is not that NASA lacks ambition, or that the engineers were not eager to attempt more. The reason is that the engineering, tested against the current radiation environment, the current heat shield certification envelope, and the current human factors data, was not ready for anything more. Let me put that in a framework that actually means something. Compare Artemis 2, a mission we are calling a triumph, to Apollo 13, a mission we remember as a disaster. In April of 1973 astronauts, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes, experienced a catastrophic cryogenic oxygen tank rupture roughly 55 hours into their translunar coast. They lost their primary electrical power. They lost their main engine as a nominal option. They lost most of their life support redundancy. Their command module was, in engineering terms, a floating coffin with a working radio. And that crew still performed a manual passive thermal roll adjustment, used the lunar module as a lifeboat and life support platform, calculated a mid-course correction burn using the Sun and the Earth's termitae as visual references, and executed a re-entry sequence that required timing accuracy of about a second and angle accuracy of about 1/4 of a degree. They did all of that with 1960s era slide rules and a computer with less memory than the machine currently in your pocket. Apollo 13 attempted and survived more operational complexity under emergency conditions than Artemis 2 attempted under nominal ones. Read that sentence twice. It is not a rebuke of Artemis. It is a recalibration of what we think progress actually looks like. From the outside, from 100,000 feet, Artemis 2 looks like the next chapter of the human story. From the inside, from the flight director's console, from the systems integration engineer's desk, from the risk officer's spreadsheet, it looks like a program that is still cautiously learning how to walk on legs it has not fully tested. That distinction matters enormously when the destination that keeps appearing in every keynote is not the moon. It is Mars, and the moon in this framing is not the goal, it is the practice run. But the practice run only proves you are ready for the main event if the practice run actually resembles the main event. And Artemis 2 did not resemble a Mars mission in any of the ways that would matter for evaluating Mars mission readiness. The central thread here, the one we will return to again and again, is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Artemis 2 was intentionally simplified because the environment it flew through, the radiation, the thermal loading, the communication blackout risk, the material aging of every polymer and every seal is still too poorly understood and too imperfectly modelled for anyone to have signed off on more ambition. The mission design is caution wearing the costume of confidence. And if we cannot even test our systems aggressively at lunar distance in the 21st century, then the idea that we are 10 to 15 years away from putting bootprints on Martian regolith is not optimism. It is marketing. But here is where the story sharpens into something that most of the public discussion never touches. Because the part of Artemis 2 that came closest to genuine failure, the part where the engineers held their breath and the risk officers stopped writing notes, was not the trajectory. It was not the radiation, it was not the communications architecture, it was the heat shield. And what happened with that heat shield is a story that ought to make you deeply, deliberately uncomfortable about what comes next. Part 3, the heat shield decision nobody actually agrees on. In December of 2022, NASA's uncrewed Artemis 1 mission completed a 25.5-day test flight around the moon. The Orion capsule splashed down in the Pacific off Baja California. The mission was declared a success and the media coverage moved on within a news cycle. But when the recovery team pulled the heat shield out of the water and brought it back to the thermal protection lab at the Marshall Space Flight Center, they found something the pre-flight thermal models had not predicted. More than 100 discrete locations on the Avcoat heat shield showed charring, cracking, and materials cloth patterns that fell outside the tolerance envelope. Pieces of the ablative material in some places had broken away in chunks rather than eroding uniformly. Some of those chunks were fingernail-sized, some were larger. The pattern was not random. It clustered in specific regions of the shield, particularly at the shoulder and around the ablator plug boundaries, in ways the pre-flight simulations had explicitly said should not occur. To understand why that matters, you have to understand how Avcoat actually works. Avcoat is not a heat-resistant shell like the reinforced carbon-carbon or the ceramic tiles on the Space Shuttle orbiter. It is an ablative system, which means it is engineered to erode in a controlled and mathematically predictable fashion. The material absorbs incoming thermal energy, chars, and the charred outer layer either burns away or is mechanically stripped by the airflow, carrying the absorbed energy with it. It is in essence a design sacrifice. The shield destroys itself in a predictable and calibrated way to protect the crew. For that process to actually work, the rate of destruction must be tightly bounded. Engineers need to know, down to a fraction of a millimeter, how much material will erode at every point on the surface, at every second during the entry trajectory. If the erosion is slower than modelled, the underlying structure absorbs heat and can fail thermally. If the erosion is faster than modelled, the shield runs out of material before the vehicle runs out of atmosphere. Either outcome ends the same way for the crew. What Artemis 1 revealed was that the erosion was not, in fact, fully predictable. Not in the specific version of Avcoat NASA had qualified. Not under the specific entry trajectory Artemis 1 flew. The root cause investigation, led by a team out of Johnson Space Center and eventually briefed to the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, took nearly 2 full years and involved partial redesign, extensive arc-jet testing, and full-scale computational fluid dynamics reruns. What they eventually concluded was that gases trapped inside the porous Avcoat material had expanded and contracted during the skip re-entry maneuver Artemis 1 used. In a skip entry, the capsule dips into the upper atmosphere, decelerates, briefly exits back into space in a suborbital hop, and then re-enters a second time for the final descent. It is a beautiful piece of flight mechanics because it spreads the peak heating pulse over a longer window and allows for tighter splashdown targeting. But it also thermally cycles the ablator, heat, cool, heat again. And that cycling caused internal gas pressures to build inside the Avcoat, cracking it from the inside and ejecting chunks from the outside. NASA's response for Artemis 2 was significant, and it was made in 2 coupled decisions. First, they abandoned the skip entry entirely and reverted Artemis 2 to a direct entry profile, one continuous ballistic plunge through the atmosphere from acquisition to drogue chute deploy. Second, they reformulated the Avcoat material itself, reducing its measured permeability from approximately 6% down to what internal documents refer to as effectively zero permeability. Denser material, less internal gas volume, fewer places for pressure to build. Those sound like reasonable engineering fixes, and they may well be, but here is the problem. And this is the problem a retired NASA senior aerothermal engineer named Charles Kamada has been raising, publicly, loudly, and with a level of institutional frustration that is unusual in a community that generally handles disagreements in private technical memos. The redesigned heat shield, with its new material formulation and its new entry profile, never been tested at lunar return velocity with a crew on board. The direct entry heating distribution is meaningfully different from the skip entry heating distribution. The zero permeability formulation behaves differently under thermal stress than the 6% formulation, and these 2 changes were implemented simultaneously, which means that in the dataset from Artemis 2, you cannot isolate the effect of either variable independently. In standard aerospace engineering practice, the sequence is supposed to go like this. Identify the failure mode, develop a candidate fix. Test the fix alone in a representative environment. Validate the results against physics-based models. Then, and only then, put humans in the vehicle. What actually happened with Artemis 2 was a compressed and pragmatic sequence. Identify the failure, develop the fix. Test the fix at the arc-jet facility and in flight representative subscale models. And then the test at full scale at lunar return velocity with a full crew was the crewed mission itself. Kamada's specific concern, and it is worth quoting his framing directly because he has repeated it in multiple technical forums, is about crack propagation dynamics in the denser Avcoat. When you reduce permeability, you change the material's stress response to thermal shock. Gas that previously could vent through microchannels is now more effectively trapped. And if a crack initiates from a manufacturing defect, from a micrometeoroid impact during the coast phase, or from ordinary thermal cycling, it may propagate differently in the new formulation than it would have in the old one. That is not speculation, that is materials science. And the dataset for this specific failure mode, in this specific material, at this specific entry velocity, is currently in the entire recorded history of human spaceflight, exactly 1 point. Artemis 2 itself, let me connect that back to the thread. The heat shield is the single most consequential subsystem during entry. If it fails, there is no backup, there is no abort. There is no rescue trajectory that can be improvised in real time from the entry corridor. And for Artemis 2, the heat shield that protected those 4 astronauts was, in a very real engineering sense, an untested configuration flying its qualification test with humans behind it. It worked. That word deserves emphasis. It worked. But it worked is not the same sentence as we understand precisely why it worked. And we understand why it worked is not the same sentence as we can guarantee it will work identically on Artemis 3 or on Artemis 4 or on the eventual Mars return vehicle. Each of those flights will have its own manufacturing variation, its own micrometeoroid history, its own entry velocity, and its own thermal profile. Now hold the current entry velocity number in your head, 11, 4 kilometers per second, because a spacecraft returning to Earth from Mars on any realistic transfer orbit currently under discussion arrives in the vicinity of 14 kilometers per second at atmospheric interface. That is roughly 3 kilometers per second faster than what Artemis 2 endured. And in the physics of hypersonic entry, velocity does not scale linearly with heating. Radiative heat load scales approximately with the 8th power of velocity, which means a roughly 27% increase in entry velocity from 11 to 14 produces roughly a factor of 8 increase in radiative heat flux at the stagnation point. The thermal environment of a Mars return is not incrementally worse than a lunar return. It is categorically different. It sits in a regime that no crewed vehicle has ever entered, that no Earth-based facility can fully replicate at scale, and that no ablative material currently qualified for human flight has been validated for. If Artemis needed a last-minute redesign to survive a lunar entry, then Mars return velocity is not an engineering challenge in the ordinary sense. It is an open question in applied physics, and we are nowhere close to a validated answer. But the heat shield is not the only thing that pushed Artemis 2 toward the edge of its envelope. Because while the engineers on the ground were watching every thermocouple during entry, the Sun, 3.5 AU away, was doing something during the mission that no one on Earth could control and no amount of hardware upgrade could have fully deflected. Part 4, the Sun that did not cooperate and the Sun that could have. Approximately 68 hours into the Artemis 2 mission, roughly midway through the outbound coast, space weather sensors at the Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado, flagged a G2-class geomagnetic storm developing in Earth's magnetosphere. A G2 storm on the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration scale is a moderate disturbance. Not the worst the Sun can throw, not the least either. It is the kind of event that reliably degrades high-latitude GPS accuracy, occasionally trips a transformer or two in northern power grids, and generates auroral displays visible several hundred kilometers south of where they would normally sit. It is, in operational terms, an event you monitor, not one you panic over. By mission day 5, the G2 had escalated to include an M7. 5 solar flare erupting from an active sunspot region on the Earth-facing side of the Sun. An M-class flare is a mid-tier solar event, powerful but below the X-class threshold that triggers the most severe operational alerts. And on the day of re-entry, a residual gone storm was still active, the tail end of a coronal hole high-speed solar wind stream that had been buffeting Earth's magnetosphere for most of the mission. None of these events on their own was catastrophic. That is not the point of this part. The point of this part is that all of them happened during a 10-day mission, and not one of them could have been predicted with enough lead time to delay the launch, alter the flight profile, or shelter the crew before the particles arrive. Artemis 2 launched during the declining but still elevated phase of solar cycle 25, at a time when the Sun's magnetic activity remains volatile even as the 11-year cycle drifts past its maximum. During this phase, coronal mass ejections, solar flares and high-speed solar wind streams remain more frequent and more intense than during solar minimum. The radiation monitors aboard Orion, distributed across 6 sensor locations inside the crew module and on the service module skin, recorded continuously elevated electron flux exceeding 1,000 particle flux units for approximately 7 consecutive days. That is not a spike. A spike is what would come next. That is a sustained bombardment. Here is what connects this directly to the argument we are building through this entire video. Artemis 2 was a 10-day mission. And in those 10 days, the crew was exposed to multiple discrete space weather events that required active monitoring, real-time dosimetry assessment, and on flight day 8, active shelter preparation. They got lucky, not because the events were harmless, they were not, but because none of them escalated to the level where the mission would have entered a life-threatening regime. A stronger flare, a faster coronal mass ejection, a direct hit from an X-class, or worse, a very rare but not impossible category of event we will discuss in Part 8. Any of those would have converted a headline-friendly mission into a national crisis. You cannot engineer luck. You cannot schedule around solar activity with the precision that a 3-year Mars mission would require. And you cannot outrun a proton travelling at roughly 1/3 of the speed of light, because by the time you see the flare in the visible light spectrum, the particle wavefront is already, at best, minutes behind, and sometimes already among you. The Sun does what the Sun does. And for 10 days it cooperated within an envelope of manageable violence. But cooperation is not a design parameter. Cooperation cannot be specified in a requirements document. And that realization that even a short lunar mission depends partly on the sun deciding not to throw its worst punch during your specific launch window is one of the most important operational lessons Artemis II quietly delivered. It is also the perfect setup for the problem that, more than any other, converts Mars from an ambitious challenge into a mathematical wall. Not the propulsion, not the heat shield, not the cost, the radiation. And what Artemis II revealed about the radiation environment beyond Earth's magnetosphere is something that ought to fundamentally reshape how we talk about the future of human deep space flight. Part 5. Leaving the shield you never knew you had. You live inside a force field. You have lived inside it every second of your life. You have never once seen it. You have never once felt it. You have never once thought about it, unless you happen to catch a lecture on planetary science, or read a very specific kind of book. The field is called the magnetosphere. It is generated by the convection of molten iron in Earth's outer liquid core, roughly 2,900 kilometers beneath your feet, and it produces a planetary magnetic field that extends tens of thousands of kilometers into interplanetary space on the sun-facing side, and stretches into a comet-like tail hundreds of thousands of kilometers into space on the anti-sun side. That field does something extraordinary. It deflects the overwhelming majority of the charged particles that stream continuously through the inner solar system. Protons, electrons, alpha particles, heavy ion. The field channels them poleward, where they interact with the upper atmosphere and produce the auroras that everyone finds beautiful and almost no one recognizes as a visible reminder that the planet is actively shielding you from something that would otherwise sterilize the surface. Without that magnetic field, the solar wind would strip away Earth's atmosphere over geological timescales, exactly the way it did to Mars roughly 4 billion years ago, and the surface radiation environment would be lethal to unshielded biology across most of the planet. You are right now in the room where you are sitting, or wherever you are watching this, protected by a magnetic bubble that has kept every living cell on this planet alive for something on the order of 5 billion years, and the instant a spacecraft crosses beyond that bubble, that protection ends. Not tapers, not fades, ends. The boundary itself is not a sharp wall, it is gradient. As you climb outward from Earth, you first pass through the Van Allen radiation belts, two roughly torus-shaped regions of charged particles trapped by the geomagnetic field. The inner belt is dominated by high-energy protons. The outer belt is dominated by high-energy electrons. Between and beyond them, the field weakens and eventually gives way to the magnetopause, the outer boundary of Earth's magnetic influence. The International Space Station orbits at roughly 400 kilometers altitude, well below the inner Van Allen belt, and even there ISS crews accumulate radiation doses roughly 10 times higher than a person at sea level. But they are still inside the magnetic shield, they are still, in the meaningful sense, protected. Artemis II was not. Once Orion crossed the magnetopause on the outbound leg, roughly 10 hours into the mission, the crew entered a radiation environment that is, from a biological perspective, fundamentally different from anything they had ever experienced during their years of ISS training or actual ISS deployments. And this is the distinction that most public discussions of spaceflight completely, and I would argue dangerously, gloss over. The ISS is dangerous. The ISS is not deep space. Deep space is a different regime. In deep space, you are exposed to two primary sources of ionizing radiation. The first is solar energetic particles, or SEP. These are bursts of protons and heavier ions accelerated to relativistic energies by solar flares and coronal mass ejection. They are sporadic, they are sometimes extraordinarily violent, and they are impossible to predict with more than a few hours of lead time, because we cannot see what the sun is going to do before it does it, and by the time we see the flare in visible light, the highest energy particles are already arriving. The second source is galactic cosmic rays, or these are high-energy particles originating from outside the solar system, accelerated by supernova remnants, active galactic nuclei, and other extreme astrophysical events across the Milky Way and beyond. GCRs are not sporadic, they are constant, they do not surge and recede on solar timescales. They are always present, always penetrating, and they carry energies that make them, for practical purposes, impossible to shield against with any spacecraft buildable amount of material. A single ion nucleus GCR can carry billions of electron volts of kinetic energy. When it passes through biological tissue, it does not deposit its energy in a narrow track the way an X-ray photon does. It shatters DNA in clustered, multi-strand damage patterns that the cell's repair machinery is measurably less capable of fixing. The Artemis II crew spent approximately 9 days beyond Earth's magnetosphere. During that time, based on preliminary dosimetry, their cumulative effective dose was roughly equivalent to what a person on Earth's surface would accumulate from natural background sources over an entire year, compressed into 9 days. 1 day in deep space equaled roughly 1 year of ordinary background exposure, and that ratio is not an estimate pulled from a model. It is drawn directly from the 6 onboard radiation detectors that log data continuously across the full mission timeline. Now the human body can tolerate some ionizing radiation. We are exposed to it every day of our lives, from radon in the soil, from cosmic secondaries that penetrate the atmosphere, from potassium-40 in our own tissues, from medical imaging when we get it. But there is a difference between background exposure and deep space exposure, and it is not just a difference of quantity. It is a difference of quality. Galactic cosmic ray heavy ions, iron nuclei being the most cited example but not the only one, deliver a track structure inside human tissue that terrestrial radiation biology has until very recently had almost no direct data on. When one of those ions passes through a cell, the DNA damage it leaves behind is not a single break. It is a cluster of breaks in close spatial proximity, along with base deletions and crosslinks, and the cell's homologous recombination repair pathway struggles to handle that clustered pattern. Repair failure produces one of 2 outcomes: cell death, which is the safer outcome, or mutation that survives and replicates, which is the pathway that eventually produces cancer, cardiovascular disease, or central nervous system degeneration years or decades after the exposure. NASA maintains a career-effective dose limit for astronauts of roughly 600 millisieverts, a figure adopted after a lengthy risk assessment process and pegged to a target of no more than approximately 3% excess lifetime risk of exposure-induced death. That sounds conservative, but it is a policy limit, not a biological threshold. There is no dose below which ionizing radiation is guaranteed safe. There is only a dose below which we, as a species, have decided the risk is acceptable for the mission we want to do. And the models that produce that 3% figure carry considerable uncertainty bars, particularly for heavy ion exposure at chronic low dose rates over multi-year timelines, because we do not have good statistical populations of humans who have received such doses. We have astronauts. Fewer than 600 human beings have ever been to space. Of those, only 24 have travelled beyond low Earth orbit, all of them during the Apollo program. And now with Artemis 2, the count moves to 28. The Artemis 2 crew accumulated, based on the preliminary integrated dosimetry, somewhere in the range of 12 to 15 millisieverts over the 9 days of deep space transit. That is well within any single mission or career limit framework you want to apply. The numbers for a 10-day mission work. That should not comfort you. Because here is where the central thread of this entire video reasserts itself with the blunt force of arithmetic. Artemis 2 lasted 9 days in deep space. A round-trip Mars mission lasts approximately 900, and when you multiply the daily exposure rate across that timeline, the numbers do not just get worse. They break. They exceed the career limit on a single mission. They approach thresholds where the models start producing risk estimates the medical community would not accept in any other context. We'll walk through the math explicitly in Part 7. But before we do, there is something that happened aboard Orion on Flight Day 8, something that most of the press coverage missed entirely, that tells you exactly how primitive our current radiation protection strategy actually is. Part 6, the fort made of luggage. For 7 consecutive days during the Artemis 2 mission, the onboard radiation instruments recorded electron flux levels that remained continuously above 1,000 particle flux units. At brief peak, but a real peak, the readings exceeded 10,000. To put that in operational context, nominal background flux in deep space during solar minimum, the calmest configurations the Sun ever adopts, runs in the low hundreds. What Artemis 2 flew through was not nominal. It was an extended elevated radiation environment driven by the combination of solar energetic particle events, coronal mass ejection secondary flux, and the sustained high-speed solar wind streams pouring out of coronal holes on the Sun's surface. The 6 radiation sensors distributed inside Orion tracked the exposure in real time, feeding continuous data streams to both the flight surgeon on the ground and the crew's own personal dosimeters. And on Flight Day 8, the crew performed something that had never before been executed in operational crewed spaceflight beyond low Earth orbit. They built a radiation shelter. The procedure is formally called HERA, Human Exploration Radiation Assessment. In its Artemis 2 implementation, the crew was directed to reposition equipment bags, water containers, food storage lockers, and personal cargo inside the crew module to construct an improvised radiation shielding barrier around the sleeping area, where they would spend the greatest number of hours per day accumulating dose. The concept is elementary physics, mass blocks particles. Water in particular is an excellent radiation shield per unit mass, because hydrogen, the most abundant element in water and the lightest element in existence, is one of the most efficient absorbers of high-energy protons and neutrons on a per-nucleon basis. Stack enough water between yourself and the particle flux, and the dose rate on your side of the wall goes down. The crew practiced the drill, they assembled the shelter, and the onboard sensors verified that the dose rate inside the improvised barrier was measurably lower than the ambient dose rate outside it. The system worked, modestly, precisely as advertised in the pre-mission planning. It reduced dose by an estimated 25 to 40% depending on the sensor location and the particle spectrum being measured. Now sit with that number for a moment, 25 to 40% reduction. That is what an all-hands crew evacuation drill using every available piece of dense cargo inside a 316 cubic meter pressurized volume can achieve. It is not zero, it is meaningful. It is also, and this is the part the press release did not lead with, entirely inadequate for the scale of the problem it is trying to solve. The Hera shelter is designed for temporary use, roughly 24 hours of protection during a peak solar particle event. It cannot be maintained for days or weeks without severely disrupting mission operations, because you cannot conduct experiments, exercise routines, meal preparation, or basic hygiene from inside a fort made of cargo bag. It offers virtually zero attenuation against the highest energy galactic cosmic rays, which carry sufficient kinetic energy to punch through meters of aluminum, generating cascades of secondary neutrons and pions as they go. And it does not scale. There is no version of this technology that shields a Mars-bound crew for 900 continuous days. This is the state-of-the-art in human deep space radiation protection in the year of Artemis 2. We instruct the crew to build a fort out of their own luggage. Let me say that again so it registers. We told 4 astronauts at the highest point in their careers that when the sun started throwing more particles than the models expected, their best available protection was to physically stack their own baggage between themselves and outer space. That is not a critique of the crew, or of the flight director, or of the engineers who designed the procedure. The procedure is entirely reasonable given the constraints. It is a critique of the constraints. Because the reason we are stacking cargo bags in the year of Artemis 2 is that we do not have active radiation shielding technology. There is no compact electromagnetic field generator that can deflect galactic cosmic rays from a crewed vehicle. There are prototypes in laboratory papers. There are theoretical concepts sketched on whiteboards. There is so far nothing you could bolt onto a spacecraft and turn on. There is no pharmaceutical countermeasure that prevents DNA damage from ionizing radiation in real time. There are radioprotective compounds under study, amphiphosphatine and its analogues, but none of them are approved or scaled for the chronic protection required by a multi-year mission. There is no passive shielding material light enough to launch in the required thickness that blocks the full spectrum of deep space radiation without producing dangerous secondary particles, because for many materials, adding mass past a certain point makes the secondary radiation environment inside the vehicle worse than the primary radiation environment outside it. We will come back to that in part 7, because it is one of the most underappreciated facts in the entire discussion. The Hera shelter on Artemis 2 was not a solution. It was an acknowledgement written in the language of engineering. It was NASA saying, in the tactful vocabulary of a flight procedure, we know we cannot fully protect you from the environment you are flying through, and here is the best partial mitigation we have. And they meant it. That mitigation is real, but acknowledgement is not solution. And the reason it matters, the reason it connects directly to the central argument of everything we have discussed so far, is that Artemis 2 flew for 10 days. The shelter was fully deployed for one event, briefly on one flight. A Mars crew would spend approximately 900 days in the same radiation environment. They would need protection not for one event, but for every event that occurs across 2.5 to 3 years, plus the continuous background flux of galactic cosmic rays that never ever stops. There is no version of a fort made of luggage that solves that problem. And as we are about to walk through, the math makes the impossibility of scaling this approach terrifyingly explicit. Part 7, the arithmetic that breaks Mars. Let me walk you through the numbers, because the numbers are where the dream of a crewed Mars mission runs into a wall that no amount of enthusiasm or funding, unaccompanied by scientific breakthrough, can climb over. A round-trip Mars mission using current or near-current chemical propulsion technology looks approximately like this. 6 to 9 months of transit from Earth to Mars. Approximately 500 days on the Martian surface, waiting for the orbital geometry to align for a fuel-efficient return trajectory. Then another 6 to 9 months of transit back to Earth. Total mission duration, somewhere between roughly 900 and 180 days. Call it 2.5 to 3 years. During the transit phases, the crew is in deep space, fully exposed to solar energetic particles and galactic cosmic rays, with no planetary body and no meaningful magnetic field between them and interplanetary space. During the surface stay, Mars offers partial protection. The planet's mass blocks radiation from below, and the thin Martian atmosphere provides a small amount of overhead attenuation. But Mars has no global dipole magnetic field, and the atmospheric surface pressure is less than 1% of Earth's. The measured surface radiation dose rate on Mars, based on the Curiosity rover's radiation assessment detector, is approximately 233 microsieverts per day. That is roughly 60 to 70% of the deep space transit dose rate, better than transit. Nowhere close to Earth. Run the full calculation. transit exposure plus surface exposure plus a statistical allowance for at least one moderate solar particle event during a mission of this duration, and the total estimated integrated dose for a Mars round trip comes to approximately 1000 to 1200 millisieverts, depending on the assumptions you make about solar cycle timing and shielding architecture. Now let that number breathe. NASA's career limit for astronauts is 600 millisieverts. A single Mars round-trip mission exceeds that career limit by roughly 70 to 100%. One trip to Mars and back gives every crew member more integrated radiation dose than the agency currently considers acceptable across an entire astronaut career. And that 600 millisievert career limit is not conservative in the way a lay reader might assume. It corresponds to roughly a 3% excess lifetime risk of exposure-induced death. Extrapolate to 1000 to 1200 millisieverts, and the estimated excess lifetime cancer mortality risk rises to somewhere between 5 and 10%, depending on which biological model you use, which age and sex distribution your crew has, and how the model handles the elevated relative biological effectiveness of heavy ions compared to gamma photons. Some model runs place the upper uncertainty bound as high as 20% excess lifetime risk. 1 in 5. Roll a 5-sided die, and one face says the mission is what eventually kills you. The European Space Agency, in a series of published assessments and technical white papers, has stated in language that is unusually direct for a diplomatic, multinational body that a crewed Mars mission is not currently viable due to radiation exposure. Not difficult, not requiring further study, not viable. Read the exact phrasing. It is uncharacteristically blunt for the vocabulary that space agencies typically use in public documents. And here is why shielding does not solve the problem, no matter how intuitive it feels that it should. Galactic cosmic rays are not ordinary radiation. They are relativistic heavy ions carrying billions of electron volts. When a GCR heavy ion strikes a spacecraft shield, whether the shield is aluminum, polyethylene or water, it does not simply stop. It fragments, it knocks apart the nuclei of the shield material. It produces a cascade of secondary particles, neutrons, lighter ions. Those secondaries spray through the interior of the vehicle in an outward radiating cone from every impact point. In certain configurations, the secondary radiation environment inside the spacecraft is actually more biologically harmful than the primary radiation environment outside it. This phenomenon is called secondary particle generation, and it is one of the most counterintuitive facts in space radiation physics. It means that beyond a certain shielding thickness, adding more material makes the problem worse, not better. There is an optimal shielding thickness for any given material, a point on the curve where you get the maximum net dose reduction. For aluminum, that optimum sits somewhere in the range of 20 to 30 centimeters. For polyethylene, thanks to its high hydrogen content, the optimum performs somewhat better on a per gram basis. For water, better still. But even at the optimum, for the full galactic cosmic ray spectrum, the achievable dose reduction is only about 20 to 30%. You cannot get to zero, you cannot get close to zero. You can shave the margins by a fifth to a third, and the margins we have already shown are not enough. Let me bring this back explicitly to the central thread. Artemis 2 spent 9 days in the deep space radiation environment and accumulated a modest, manageable integrated dose. That dose was manageable because the mission was short. A Mars mission is 100 times longer. The dose scales with time. There is no material solution that reduces a 1000 millisievert exposure to a 600 millisievert exposure without making the spacecraft so heavy that it becomes launch mass prohibitive under any propulsion architecture currently under development. There is no operational workaround because you cannot fly faster with current engines by any meaningful factor, and you cannot shorten the Martian surface, stay below the orbital return window because celestial mechanics does not negotiate. This is not a delay, this is a ceiling. A hard physics-imposed ceiling produced by the interaction between high-energy particles and the biology of a species that evolved under a magnetic shield. Until someone invents a material that stops galactic cosmic rays without generating secondary radiation, or a compact spacecraft-scale magnetic field generator that can deflect them, or a biological intervention that renders human DNA measurably more resilient to relativistic heavy ion damage, none of which currently exist in a form that could be flown, that ceiling holds. The dream of a crewed Mars mission does not fail because of rockets. It does not fail because of budgets. It fails because the universe is trying, mechanically and continuously, to kill you every second you spend outside Earth's magnetic field. And in the year of Artemis 2, we still have no functional answer to that. But if chronic exposure is the slow killer, there is another scenario that is faster, more violent, and far more relevant to this conversation than most people realize. Because there was a moment once, in the spaceflight record, where the line between a successful mission and a lethal one was not skill, not engineering, not planning. It was timing, pure blind geometric timing. And the near miss that resulted has never really left the archive of stories that flight surgeons tell in private. Part 8. The event that would have killed them. In August of 1972, in the 4-month gap between the return of Apollo 16 and the launch of Apollo 17, the Sun released one of the most powerful solar energetic particle events of the entire 20th century. The event, remembered in the space weather literature as the August 4 event or the Bastille-adjacent 1972 storm, produced a torrent of high-energy protons that, if delivered to an unshielded human being in interplanetary space, would have imparted an estimated whole-body dose of approximately 26 sieverts. Not millisieverts, sieverts. A dose of roughly 5 sieverts is considered universally lethal within weeks in the absence of aggressive medical intervention. 26 sieverts would kill an astronaut within hours through what is called the acute radiation syndrome cerebrovascular subtype, massive gastrointestinal breakdown, central nervous system failure, bone marrow collapse before the marrow even has time to notice. Apollo 16 splashed down in April of 1972. Apollo 17 launched in December of 1972. The August 4 event fell almost exactly in the middle of that gap. If either mission had shifted by a few months, if Apollo 16 had slipped late, or if Apollo 17 had launched early, the crew of that mission would have been in lunar space, beyond the magnetopause, during the most lethal solar energetic particle event of the 20th century. There is no shielding configuration on the Apollo command module that could have attenuated a 26 sievert dose to a survivable level. There was no shelter protocol on the vehicle. There was no radiation bunker. There was no emergency abort trajectory that could have gotten them back inside the magnetosphere fast enough. The crew would have received a lethal dose within a few tens of minutes. They would have died in space on live coverage, and there would have been nothing anyone at Houston could have done except watch the telemetry and log the dosimetry. This is not hypothetical fear-mongering. This is a historical fact applied to a counterfactual timeline that missed reality by weeks. The full analysis was performed after the fact by the space radiation health community, and it is one of the reasons that every serious flight surgeon since 1972 has treated solar particle events not as a design margin problem but as an existential mission risk. Now apply the same physics to Artemis 2, same sun, same particle acceleration mechanisms, same fundamental unpredictability. The Orion Hera shelter, as we described in Part 6, offers meaningful attenuation against moderate solar particle events, the kind that deliver integrated doses in the tens or low hundreds of millisieverts. It offers effectively no meaningful attenuation against a 1972 class event. The shelter would have reduced the dose, not by enough, not remotely by enough. Reducing 26 sieverts by even 50% leaves you at 13 sieverts, which is still, medically, an unsurvivable dose. The Artemis 2 crew was in deep space for 9 days. During those 9 days, the Sun cooperated at the low to moderate end of its available spectrum. It threw some medium punches, the G2 storm, the M-class flare, the coronal hole high-speed stream, but nothing above the X-class threshold, and nothing remotely approaching the August 4 1972 event. They were not hit with the big one. And the reason they were not hit with the big one was not that we predicted a low probability window. It was not that we engineered against it. The reason is luck. Mission survival in deep space as a function of solar activity is still probabilistic, not controlled. That sentence should be printed on the wall of every conference room where Mars mission planning takes place. Because luck does not scale, you can be lucky for 10 days. Being lucky for 900 is a different proposition entirely. The mathematics of Poisson-distributed rare events say that the probability of encountering at least one severe solar particle event over the course of a 3-year Mars mission is not negligible. Depending on where the mission timeline falls within the 11-year solar cycle, that probability sits somewhere between 15 and 30%. Roll a die weighted 1 to 4. If it comes up 1, your crew receives a dose that is potentially lethal, certainly mission terminating in terms of long-term crew health, on a mission from which there is no early return, no evacuation trajectory, and no medical infrastructure capable of treating acute radiation syndrome. That is the reality of crewed deep space human exploration in the present decade, and it connects directly to everything else we have discussed. The heat shield that needed a workaround, the trajectory that was deliberately conservative, the radiation environment that ran continuously above baseline on a short mission. All of it points in the same direction. We are not conquering space, we are negotiating with it. And the terms of that negotiation get worse the farther we go and the longer we stay. Part 9. The impacts you did not know were happening. During the lunar transit and near flyby phase of the Artemis 2 mission, the crew documented and photographed 6 discrete meteoroid impact flashes on the lunar surface within a single 1-hour observation window. 6 visible flashes. 6 objects striking the moon at speeds of tens of kilometers per second, each depositing enough kinetic energy on impact to be recorded as a visible bloom against the dark lunar limb. This was the first time in human history that crewed spacecraft observers had documented lunar impact flashes in real time from cislunar space. Robotic cameras and ground-based telescopes have been recording lunar impacts for decades under programs like Midas at Marshall Space Flight Center. But having human observers at close range from a vantage point no crewed vehicle had occupied since 1972 added something that photometric data cannot capture: scale context. The visceral recognition that the volume of space between planetary bodies is not empty. It is a shooting gallery moving at hypersonic velocities in every direction. 6 impacts in 1 hour on a lunar surface area of roughly 38 million square kilometers might sound like a low frequency, and on a per-unit area basis it is. The probability of any given point on the moon being struck by an observable magnitude impactor in a 1-hour window is vanishingly small. But the moon has no atmosphere. Every particle, no matter how small, arrives at the surface at full incoming velocity. There is no aerodynamic braking, there is no ablation before impact. A grain of quartz sand moving at 20 kilometers per second delivers kinetic energy comparable to a small caliber bullet. The moon, in its cratered geological memory, is a 4 billion year time-lapse recording of what happens to any unprotected surface exposed to that environment for long enough. This matters directly to the Mars discussion in a way that is often glossed over. Mars is frequently presented as safer than the moon in terms of surface impacts because Mars has an atmosphere. That is technically true, but the Martian atmosphere is thin. Surface pressure is less than 1% of Earth's sea level pressure. It burns up the smallest micrometeoroids, roughly millimeter scale and below, but anything larger reaches the surface at close to lethal velocity. For a Mars transit vehicle in interplanetary space, and for a surface habitat exposed to a thin atmosphere for years at a time, the operational threat is not a single catastrophic impact. It is the cumulative effect of continuous bombardment by microparticles that erode exterior surfaces, degrade seals, pit optical instruments, and slowly compromise the structural integrity of any object left exposed to the environment across months and years. Shielding a habitat against microparticle erosion is possible. It has been demonstrated on the ISS through a combination of Whipple shields, multi-layer insulation blankets, and strategic component placement. But it adds mass, complexity, and ongoing maintenance burden that compounds every other logistical challenge of a Mars mission. And the interplanetary micrometeoroid environment, particularly at heliocentric distances between 1 and 1.5 to U, is not as well characterized as the near-Earth environment. The models we use to estimate impact frequency in Mars transfer orbits are based on limited data from a small number of interplanetary probes, and there is genuine scientific debate about whether current estimates undersample the small particle end of the distribution. The Artemis II observation, limited as it was in duration and viewing angle, suggests that the near-lunar impact environment is at least as active as the current models predict, and possibly more so. Extend that to a 9-month interplanetary transit, and the cumulative exposure to microparticle impacts becomes a design constraint that current Mars mission architectures have addressed only in preliminary form. Space does not look hostile from Earth. In photographs it looks serene, silent, empty. But what Artemis II quietly demonstrated in this small but telling observation is that the silence is a perceptual illusion. The volume between planetary bodies is a violent, active, high-velocity environment, and the illusion of emptiness becomes more dangerous the longer any human-built object stays inside it. Part 10. The lie the human eye keeps telling us. There is a reason every photograph of space looks essentially the same. A black field dotted with points of light, occasionally interrupted by a planet or a nebula. Our eyes evolved to detect visible light between roughly 400 and 700 nanometers, and in that narrow band, the volume between astronomical bodies looks empty because there is very little for our eyes to see. But that visual appearance is one of the most operationally dangerous misconceptions in human spaceflight, because the region of space between Earth and Mars is not empty. It is saturated with hazards, and it is only invisible to us because we did not evolve the sensors that would let us see them. We have already walked through the radiation environment, solar energetic particles arriving in unpredictable bursts, galactic cosmic rays streaming continuously from every direction of the sky. But radiation is only one component of the interplanetary medium. The solar wind itself, a continuous outflow of charged plasma from the sun's corona at velocities ranging from roughly 300 to 800 kilometers per second, exerts real pressure on every surface it touches. It carries embedded magnetic field lines that interact with spacecraft electronics. It creates a dynamic, fluctuating electromagnetic environment that can induce currents in wiring, degrade solar cell junctions through radiation damage over months, and interfere with high-gain communication link margins. Then there are the microparticles, dust grains left over from the formation of the solar system. cometary debris shed on tens of thousands of orbital passages, fragments of ancient collisions between minor bodies in the asteroid belt, all of it drifting through interplanetary space at relative velocities that can exceed 50 kilometers per second when the geometry aligns unfavorably. At those speeds, a particle the size of a grain of rice carries the kinetic energy of a hand grenade at close range. Spacecraft in low Earth orbit already deal with this hazard. The ISS has performed dozens of debris avoidance maneuvers over its operational lifetime, and its cupola windows have been replaced due to accumulated impact damage. But the ISS operates in a relatively well-tracked environment where the US Space Surveillance Network catalogues a significant fraction of the objects large enough to threaten it, and where a resupply mission is a matter of days or weeks away. In interplanetary space, there is no tracking network, there is no warning system. There is only probability, and this is the insight that ties directly back to the central thread. Single event risks, a meteoroid impact, a solar flare, an electronic system malfunction can be analysed individually, and for any given single event the probability may be acceptably low. But a Mars mission is not a single event. It is 900 days of continuous simultaneous exposure to every one of these hazards, and risk accumulates. A 1 in 10,000 daily probability of a micrometeoroid penetrating a critical seal becomes something on the order of a 1 in 11 probability over the course of the full mission timeline. A 1 in 100 monthly probability of a severe solar storm becomes an approaching certainty over 30 months. The mathematics of independent probabilistic events compounded over long durations produces cumulative risk numbers that no honest risk officer would accept for any other engineering domain. The environment is not empty, it is actively hostile, and its hostility does not always announce itself with a single dramatic event. Sometimes, and often, it grinds, it erodes. It degrades every material, every seal, every polymer, every optical coating, every electronic junction every day for years. Satellites in interplanetary space, the few we have flown, routinely lose efficiency, degrade in performance, and eventually fail. Not because of a single catastrophic malfunction, but because of the cumulative punishment of an environment that never stops attacking. Artemis 2 was out there for 9 days. The external thermal coatings on Orion showed measurable degradation. The solar arrays showed measurable micro-impact traces. The external radiator surfaces showed measurable erosion patterns. Multiply those changes by a factor of 100, and you begin to appreciate the true engineering challenge of keeping a crewed vehicle nominally functional across a Mars round trip. Not alive, not lit up. Functional in the sense of being capable of performing every one of the mission-critical maneuvers, particularly the trans-Earth injection burn, at the end of the mission that it will be required to perform at the beginning. We are not building vehicles for that operational profile yet, not remotely. And the gap between what we have and what a Mars mission would require is not one of incremental improvement. It is a gap that requires materials science breakthroughs that have not yet been demonstrated in prototype, let alone flight qualified. That is the reality. And it gets worse when you stop looking at the vehicle and start looking at the people inside it. Part 11, the body breakdown time. The human body is a biological machine calibrated over roughly 6 million years of hominid evolution to operate under a very specific and very narrow set of environmental conditions. 1 standard gravity of continuous mechanical loading. 1 atmosphere of ambient pressure at sea level or something reasonably close to it. A 24-hour light-dark cycle that entrains circadian rhythms through the retinohypothalamic tract. A planetary magnetic shield that filters out most of the ionizing radiation that would otherwise cross the atmosphere. Remove any one of those conditions and the body begins to malfunction in predictable ways. Remove all of them, as a Mars mission would, for a duration measured in years, and the malfunctions compound into a cascading physiological failure that no exercise program, no pharmaceutical intervention, and no amount of psychological willpower can fully prevent. Start with the bones. In microgravity, the human skeleton begins to demineralize almost immediately. Without the continuous mechanical loading that gravity provides through weight-bearing activities, standing, walking, holding your head upright, the osteoclasts, the cells that resorb bone tissue, outpace the osteoblasts, the cells that build new bone. The net result, documented across decades of Skylab, Mir, and International Space Station data, is a loss of roughly 1 to 1.5% of bone mineral density per month, concentrated in the load-bearing bones of the hips, spine, and lower extremities. Do that math over a 6 to 9 month Mars transit, and a crew member arriving in Mars orbit will have lost somewhere between 10 and 15% of their bone density. That is equivalent to compressing several decades of age-related osteoporosis into a matter of months. And the loss does not fully reverse upon return to gravity, even after a lengthy Earth-based rehabilitation. Longitudinal studies of ISS crews have shown that even a year after landing, some astronauts have not recovered their pre-flight bone density to baseline. A Mars crew, spending 9 months in transit, 500 days on Mars at only 38% gravity, and then another 9 months in transit back, faces a cumulative bone loss profile that has no direct analogue in human medical history. The skeletal muscle system follows a similar trajectory. Without gravity to work against, skeletal muscles, particularly the postural muscles of the legs, back, and trunk, atrophy. Losses of 20 to 30% of muscle mass have been documented across 6-month ISS deployments, despite a daily exercise protocol involving resistive exercise on the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, aerobic training on the Cevis cyclogometer, and treadmill running on the T2. That protocol requires more than 2 hours of dedicated exercise per day, every day for the entire mission. 2 hours a day, faithfully executed for 6 months, and the crew still returns with roughly a fifth of their muscle mass gone. The exercise does not prevent the loss, it slows it. And on a Mars mission, where the transit exposure to microgravity is longer, where the surface stay is at 38% gravity, itself a partial loading environment that is not fully understood physiologically, and where the return transit adds another half year of microgravity before Earth arrival, the cumulative musculoskeletal degradation would be unprecedented. Then there is the cardiovascular system. In microgravity, the heart does not have to pump blood against gravity to maintain cerebral perfusion. Over time, the cardiovascular system adapts, which is a polite medical way of saying it deconditions. The left ventricular mass decreases, stroke volume decreases, baroreceptor sensitivity changes. Vascular tone in the lower extremities weakens because the venous system is no longer required to counteract gravitational pooling. When astronauts return to Earth, they experience orthostatic intolerance, dizziness, and sometimes syncope when they try to stand upright because their cardiovascular systems have forgotten how to fight gravity. On a Mars mission, this becomes a mission-critical concern in a way it has never been on the ISS. On Mars arrival day, the crew will have spent 6 to 9 months in microgravity, and they will land on a planet with 38% Earth gravity. They will need to exit the vehicle, operate in pressurized suits, perform physical labor, potentially conduct emergency operations if the landing damages a critical system, and their cardiovascular systems will be operating in a deconditioned state that no ISS returnee has ever had to work through on a hostile planet with no medical infrastructure. There is no built-in recovery buffer in any current Mars mission concept. You do not get a month of rest to reconstitute before you begin operations. You land, you work. The vision impairment problem is perhaps the most alarming of the physiological findings because it was discovered relatively recently and it is still poorly understood mechanistically. The syndrome is called Spaceflight-Associated Neuroocular Syndrome, or SANS, and it has been documented across a significant fraction of long-duration ISS crew members. In microgravity, fluid normally distributed in the lower body redistributes cephalad upward toward the head. This increases intracranial pressure, which presses on the optic nerves and reshapes the eyeballs, producing measurable changes in visual acuity and optic disc structure. Some astronauts have returned from ISS deployments with persistent visual changes that have not fully resolved even years later. The exact mechanism is not fully characterized. The long-term consequences across a multi-year mission are essentially unknown, and there is no proven countermeasure available for flight. The immune system suppresses in microgravity. This has been documented through changes in T-cell function, natural killer cell activity, and viral reactivation profiles. Latent herpes viruses, herpes simplex 1, Epstein-Barr, varicella zoster, reactivate in astronauts at significantly higher rates than in ground-based control populations. Wound healing slows, skin barrier function changes, and all of this is happening inside a closed, recirculated atmosphere where any pathogen that gains a foothold has nowhere to go and multiple hosts to potentially infect. Now compound these effects. A crew arrives at Mars after 9 months of bone loss, muscle atrophy, cardiovascular deconditioning, potential vision impairment, and measurable immune suppression. They perform 500 days of surface operations in a hostile environment with limited medical capability, no surgical infrastructure, and a pharmacy that had to be packed on Earth 18 months earlier. They then spend another 9 months in microgravity on the return leg. The cumulative physiological damage across this timeline is unlike anything ever experienced in the history of human spaceflight, because no one has ever been away from a one-gravity environment for that long. And every one of those degradations is happening on top of the radiation exposure we walked through in parts 5, 6, and 7. Radiation damages DNA, microgravity impairs the ability to repair DNA. The two effects do not merely add, they synergize. The result is a biological environment inside each crew member's body that is degrading on multiple fronts simultaneously, with no ability to reset the clock until they return to Earth. The human body is not designed for this environment. That is not a rhetorical statement. It is a statement of measurable, documented biology, and it connects directly to the central thesis. Artemis 2 lasted 9 days in deep space, and the crew came home essentially healthy. But the scaling factor from Artemis 2 to a Mars mission is not simply 9 days to 900. It is 9 days of manageable reversible risk to 900 days of compounding and in critical dimensions irreversible biological damage. The body is another ceiling, another hard limit that enthusiasm cannot climb over. And we have not even yet discussed the part that may in the end prove hardest to fix. Because bones can be strengthened with bisphosphonates, muscles can be maintained with exercise. But the human mind sealed inside a metal cylinder for 3 years, with no possibility of rescue, no real-time communication with anyone outside the crew, and no exit, is a problem that we are only just beginning to characterize. Part 12, The Psychological Threshold. In 2010, 6 volunteers entered a sealed facility on the outskirts of Moscow and did not come out for 520 days. The Mars 500 experiment, jointly conducted by the Russian Institute of Biomedical Problems and the European Space Agency, remains the longest durations simulated Mars mission ever attempted. The participants lived and worked inside a connected series of modules totaling approximately 550 cubic meters, roughly the volume of a modest single-family house. They performed simulated mission tasks, conducted scientific experiments, and communicated with a fictional mission control that introduced realistic communication delays matched to the geometry of an actual Mars transit. They did not go to space, not 1 meter. They were on the ground the entire time, in a facility a few miles from downtown Moscow, and they could have walked out at any moment. And despite all of that, the psychological effects were significant enough to have been cited in every serious Mars mission planning document produced since. By the midpoint of the simulation, crew members were experiencing disrupted sleep architecture, increased fatigue markers, decreased task motivation, and interpersonal friction that measurably affected mission performance. 2 of the 6 crew members became markedly sedentary, spending increasing amounts of time in their bunks. 1 crew member developed a chronic sleep disorder that persisted for the remainder of the confinement. Social dynamics fractured along fault lines that the pre-mission psychological screening had not predicted and would not have predicted because the specific pressures of 520 days of isolation with a fixed peer group in a confined volume are difficult to reproduce in any shorter analog. Psychologists studying the accumulated data identified what they now call the third quarter effect, a predictable psychological low point that recurs approximately 3/4 of the way through any long-duration isolated deployment. It shows up in Antarctic winter over crews at McMurdo and Concordia. It shows up in submarine deployments. It shows up in long-duration hospital stays and notably in extended incarceration. The mind, knowing that the endpoint is still meaningfully far away, but that the novelty of the environment has fully worn off, enters a phase of depleted motivation that can manifest as depression, irritability, social withdrawal, or in more extreme cases, reckless behavior. On a Mars mission, the third quarter point would fall during the Martian surface stay. That is precisely the phase when crew performance is most operationally critical, when the crew is farthest from Earth, and when the communication delay is at its maximum. A message sent from Mars, depending on the orbital geometry at the moment of transmission, takes between 4 and 24 minutes to reach Earth. A reply takes the same. That means a conversation that would occupy 30 seconds by phone on Earth becomes an hours-long exchange of one-way messages. There is no real-time interaction, no spontaneous emotional support from family. No ability to call a therapist and have an immediate response. The crew is psychologically alone in a way no human being has ever been alone. And there is one factor that distinguishes a Mars mission from every isolation analog we have ever studied. In Mars 500, the participants could have quit. On a submarine, the captain can surface. In Antarctica, an evacuation flight can be arranged in weather-dependent windows. On Mars, there is no exit. The crew cannot return early. They cannot leave the habitat for more than a few hours during suited excursions. They cannot escape each other. They are locked together for 900 days with no possibility of rescue, no possibility of personnel rotation, and no possibility of early return. If a crew member develops an acute psychotic episode, and the general population incidence of new-onset psychotic breaks is approximately 1 per 100 person years, compounded upward by the sleep disruption, isolation and stress inherent to the mission, there is no psychiatrist to consult in real time. There is no hospital, there is no medication regimen beyond what was packed at launch. The remaining crew must manage the situation themselves inside a habitat the size of a small apartment, while continuing to operate the most complex and dangerous mission in human history. This is another dimension of the scaling problem. Artemis 2 lasted 10 days. The crew trained together for years. They were in continuous real-time communication with mission control. They could see Earth out the window at any point during the mission. And even on that short flight, the pre-mission psychological screening protocols were extensive. The in-flight monitoring was continuous, and the mission design deliberately managed workload to prevent fatigue-induced errors during the highest risk phases. Scale that to 900 days. Remove the real-time communication. Remove the visible Earth. Remove the knowledge that help is a few days away. What you have left is a psychological environment that has no precedent in human experience, and no tested countermeasure that we know actually holds up. The mind, like the body, like the heat shield, like the radiation dosimeter, is another system that works at lunar scale and breaks at Mars scale. And this pattern is not coincidence, it is the pattern. It is the fundamental truth that Artemis 2 revealed whether it meant to or not. Mars is not a bigger moon, and the distinction, once you internalize it, changes everything. Part 13, the distance that is not what you think it is. Here is a number most people know. The moon is approximately 384,000 kilometers from Earth. Artemis 2 covered that distance, looped around the lunar far side, and returned in about 10 days. Here is a number most people have heard but have never truly internalized. Mars at closest approach sits about 55 million kilometers from Earth. At maximum separation, when the two planets are on opposite sides of the Sun, the distance is roughly 400 million kilometers. The average distance for a realistic Hohmann transfer trajectory is somewhere around 225 million kilometers of travel path, because the ship is not flying a straight line. It is flying an ellipse. Let me put that in a framework that actually means something. The moon is roughly 1 light second away. You could aim a laser at the moon and see the reflected pulse in a little over 2 seconds. Mars at average orbital geometry is roughly 11 light minutes away. The moon in cosmic terms is a weekend excursion. Mars is the other side of the continent, and the roads are ellipses that only open at certain times of the year. The ratio between them is roughly 143 to 1. Mars in transit distance is about 143 times farther than the moon.
You might be tempted to assume that Mars is simply a 1,430-day mission, a scaled-up version of the same thing. That is the lie. That is the assumption that makes Mars sound merely hard instead of physically prohibitive. Because distance in space does not scale linearly with anything that matters to a crewed mission. Almost nothing about it does. Start with orbital mechanics. You cannot fly to Mars whenever the mood strikes. The planets are moving. Earth orbits the Sun in 365.25 days. Mars orbits in 687 Earth days. The geometry that permits a fuel-efficient transfer, a Hohmann transfer or one of its close cousins, only aligns approximately once every 26 months. Miss your launch window, and you wait 2 years for the next one. This means a Mars mission cannot be shortened by simply going faster with your existing engines, because you also need to arrive when Mars is in the correct position, and you need the return orbital geometry to allow a trans-Earth injection burn from the surface. Mission duration is not primarily an engineering preference. It is set by celestial mechanics, and celestial mechanics does not negotiate. Then there is the energy requirement. Getting to the moon requires a total velocity change, called delta V in the trade, of roughly 4 kilometers per second departing from low Earth orbit. Getting to Mars on a Hohmann transfer requires approximately 5 kilometers per second departure delta V. That sounds like a modest increase, about 22%. But delta V, through the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation, is exponentially related to fuel mass. Every additional unit of velocity change requires exponentially more propellant, and you need delta V for the Mars orbit insertion burn, and the descent to the surface, and the ascent back to orbit from Mars, and the trans-Earth injection burn, and any mid-course corrections along the way. The total mission delta V for a Mars round trip is roughly 3 to 4 times that of a lunar round trip, which translates through the rocket equation into a fuel mass requirement that is not 3 to 4 times higher, but tens of times higher, depending on the specific propulsion architecture. And then there is the communication delay. At the moon, one-way signal delay is roughly 3 seconds. You can hold what is functionally a real-time conversation with lunar crews. There is a small awkwardness, like a slightly bad video call, but the pattern of conversation is preserved. At Mars distance, the one-way delay ranges from 4 to 24 minutes. That is a minimum of 8 minutes for a single exchange, and up to 48 minutes at unfavorable geometry. Ask a question, wait 10 minutes for it to arrive. Wait for the crew to receive it, formulate a response, and transmit. Wait another 10 minutes for the answer to come back. In an emergency where seconds matter, mission control on Earth cannot provide real-time guidance. They cannot talk a crew member through a life-saving procedure. They cannot say the word abort and have anyone hear it in time to do anything about it. The crew, from a decision-making perspective, is entirely alone. Artemis 2 was a sprint. Launch. Coast, flyby, coast, splashdown. The distance was manageable. The communication was effectively real-time. The consumables loadout was sized for a few weeks with margin. The risk exposure was compressed into a narrow window of continuous monitoring. Mars is not a sprint, it is a siege. It is a multi-year continuous commitment in an environment where every system, propulsion, life support, radiation protection, thermal management, food production, water recycling, atmospheric processing must function continuously without resupply, without repair from Earth, and without any option for an early return home. Not for weeks, for years, and this is not a linear scaling of the same problem. It is a categorical shift into a different regime of mission, recognizing that shift is essential. Because almost every rhetorical argument for Mars feasibility rests on the assumption that the problems are the same as the Moon's problems, only bigger. They are not. They are different problems, and some of them may not have solutions available on the timescale of a human lifetime. One of those problems is the one we touched on in parts 2 and 3 and promised to return to, the re-entry problem, because if Artemis 2 re-entered at 4 kilometers per second and required a last-minute heat shield redesign flown for the first time with a crew, what does Mars return at approximately 14 kilometers per second require in terms of thermal protection? The honest answer is something that does not yet exist. Part 14. The re-entry physics wall. The Orion capsule re-entered Earth's atmosphere at approximately 4 kilometers per second. In every other unit, that is 39,700 kilometers per hour, or 24,700 miles per hour, or Mach 32. It was the fastest crewed re-entry ever performed, and the redesigned Avcoat heat shield was pushed into a corner of its validated performance envelope that no crewed vehicle had previously visited. A spacecraft returning from Mars on a nominally efficient direct entry trajectory arrives at Earth's atmosphere at approximately 14 kilometers per second. That is 50,400 kilometers per hour. The difference is roughly 3 kilometers per second, about 27% faster in velocity terms. In your car, on a highway, that is the difference between 60 miles per hour and 76 miles per hour. It sounds moderate. In the physics of hypersonic re-entry, it is not moderate. It is transformational. Aerodynamic heating during hypersonic entry is a function of velocity, and the dominant contributor at speeds above about 10 kilometers per second is not convective heating from the boundary layer. It is radiative heating from the compressed, superheated plasma in the shock layer directly in front of the vehicle. That plasma becomes hot enough to radiate energy like a small piece of a stellar photosphere. And radiative heating scales not linearly with velocity, not even quadratically, but approximately with the 8th power of velocity in the relevant regime. Let me make sure that number registers because it is the single most important scaling relationship in this entire discussion, the 8th power. If you increase entry velocity by a factor of 1, 27, from 11 to 14 kilometers per second, radiative heating increases by roughly 1. 27 raised to the 8th power. That works out to approximately 8.2. Not 27% more heating, 8 times more heating. No crewed vehicle has ever been designed for that thermal environment. No heat shield has ever been flight tested at that velocity with humans aboard. The Avcoat system on Orion was engineered and qualification tested for lunar return velocities of roughly 11 kilometers per second. Extending it to Mars return velocities is not an incremental engineering upgrade. It requires a fundamental re-evaluation of the ablation physics, the structural response, the failure modes at heat fluxes that have never been directly experimentally accessed with a crewed-class vehicle. Ground-based arc jet facilities can simulate portions of that environment, but no facility on Earth can replicate the full combination of stagnation heating, radiative heating, ionized flow chemistry, and total heat load at Mars return conditions at flight scale. The plasma communication blackout problem is also amplified at higher entry velocities. The plasma sheath becomes denser, more opaque to radio frequencies, and persists across a longer entry corridor. At Mars return speeds, the blackout window could extend to 7, 8, potentially even 10 minutes of continuous communication loss. That is 8 to 10 minutes of falling through fire with no telemetry, no voice loop, and no way for ground observers to know some weather the shield is holding. NASA's own technical roadmaps and the Mars Design Reference Architecture documents explicitly acknowledge this. Mars return atmospheric entry is listed as a critical technology gap, a capability that does not currently exist and must be developed before a crewed Mars mission can proceed with acceptable risk. It is not a materials engineering problem alone. It is a coupled multi-physics problem involving aerothermodynamics, ablation chemistry, structural mechanics, and non-equilibrium plasma physics, operating simultaneously at energy levels that push current computational fluid dynamics codes toward the edges of their validated regimes. This is the wall, not a barrier that can be scaled with more funding or more institutional will. A physics wall that requires solutions we have not yet invented. Artemis 2 demonstrated that we can barely handle lunar return. Mars return sits in a regime that current technology cannot address. And the scaling laws of atmospheric re-entry physics guarantee that the gap is not proportional to the velocity difference. It is exponential. And even if we solve the re-entry problem, if we developed a heat shield material and configuration that survived 14 kilometers per second, if we validated it in flight, if we certified it for human use, we still have to deal with a problem that in some ways is harder than the physics of arriving and leaving. We have to keep 6 people alive in the middle for 3 years, in an environment where everything they need must either travel with them or be manufactured on site. And the logistics of that requirement are staggering in a way most Mars advocates never quite reach in public discussion. Part 15. The supply chain impossibility. A single human being in space requires approximately 5 kilograms of food per day, roughly 5 liters of drinking water per day, and about 84 kilograms of breathable oxygen per day. Those figures represent the pure metabolic minimums, and they do not include water for personal hygiene, water for food preparation, atmospheric nitrogen for pressure maintenance, carbon dioxide scrubbing capacity, urine and solid waste processing, and the countless smaller consumables, medications, spare parts, clothing, cleaning supplies, filters, gaskets, and personal hygiene items that a crew needs in order to function operationally rather than merely biologically survive. For a crew of 6 on a 900-day mission, the food alone works out to roughly 13,500 kilograms. 13.5 metric tons of food. Water per unit mass is heavier. Even with the aggressive recycling systems currently flown on the ISS, which recover approximately 93% of water through the Environmental Control and Life Support Systems Water Processor Assembly, the makeup water requirement for a Mars missions is substantial because no recycling system currently runs at 100% efficiency, and any failure of the recycling system requires a stored reserve capable of bridging the gap until repair. Total consumables mass for a 6-person 900-day Mars mission, including food, water reserves, atmospheric gases, medical supplies, spare parts across every critical subsystem, and contingency stocks, is estimated across most credible mission and architectures at somewhere between 40 and 60 metric tons, depending on the assumed recycling efficiency and the acceptable safety margin. SpaceX's Starship, the largest launch vehicle currently in active development, has a projected payload capacity to Mars transfer orbit of approximately 100 metric tons, based on public target specifications. That sounds more than sufficient for the consumables, but the consumables are only one line item in the total mass budget. The habitat itself, the descent stage, the ascent stage, the surface power system, the surface habitat, the pressurized rovers, the spacesuits with their orbital replacement units, the scientific payloads, the redundant communication systems, all of it must be launched from Earth and delivered to Mars. Current estimates for a minimal crewed Mars mission, not a colony, not a permanent settlement, just a single expedition of 6 astronauts landing, surviving 500 days on the surface, and returning to Earth, require somewhere between 4 and 10 Starship-class launches, depending on the specific mission architecture and the assumed level of in-situ resource utilization. And if you want the level of redundancy that any responsible risk officer would require for a mission with no abort mode, a backup habitat, a spare ascent vehicle, a redundant life support module, that number doubles. Now scale that to any concept of colonization. A permanent settlement of even 1,000 people, a village by terrestrial standards, requires not just initial supply, but continuous resupply until the settlement achieves genuine self-sufficiency. And self-sufficiency on Mars means manufacturing your own food, your own water, your own oxygen, your own building materials, your own replacement parts across every critical subsystem, your own medical supplies, and your own energy from local resources on a planet whose soil contains perchlorates that are toxic to human biology, whose atmosphere is 95% carbon dioxide, and whose surface temperature routinely drops below -80 degrees Celsius. The launch cadence required to sustain a colony of 1,000 people before self-sufficiency is achieved would number in the hundreds per year, sustained across decades. The launch infrastructure, the propellant production capacity, the manufacturing chain on Earth, the mission planning and execution overhead, the logistical coordination required to sustain a Martian settlement dwarfs anything humanity has ever attempted at any scale. The Berlin airlift, at peak, moved about 8,000 tons of cargo per day across less than 300 kilometers. A Mars colony resupply chain would require sustained delivery over 200 million kilometers on 26-month orbital windows for decades, with essentially zero tolerance for delivery failure at any point in the chain. This is the part of the Mars colonization narrative that the visionary framing tends to skip over quickly. The rocket is dramatic, the landing is cinematic, the first bootprint is generational. But the 10,000th resupply shipment, the spare water pump that has to arrive before the colony runs dry, the solar array replacement that is 2 launch windows as late, that is where colonization lives or dies. And on the arithmetic, it dies. The supply chain is physically, economically, and logistically implausible at the scale that self-sustainability requires. Artemis 2 carried a crew of 4 for 10 days in a vehicle that was launched fully provisioned from Earth. Everything they needed was aboard before they left. A Mars mission cannot operate that way at scale, and a Mars colony cannot exist without solving a supply chain problem we are not within decades of even prototyping. Part 16. The colony that cannot close its loop. The idea of a self-sustaining Mars colony has entered the public imagination as an inevitability, not a question of if, but of when. The language used by proponents, backup for civilization, multiplanetary species, insurance policy for humanity, frames it as a moral imperative, something we must do for the long-term survival of our kind. And within that framing, the technical obstacles are presented as speed bumps on the highway to destiny. Temporary inconveniences that human ingenuity will inevitably sweep aside the way it always has. But let us examine what self-sustaining actually requires, not in the vocabulary of keynote speeches, but in the vocabulary of engineering, biology, and thermodynamics. Because when you strip away the inspirational music and the CGI renders of glass-domed cities on red plains, What remains is a requirements list that ought to make anyone paying real attention very, very quiet. A self-sustaining colony is one that can continue to survive indefinitely without resupply from Earth. That word indefinitely is doing enormous work. It does not mean surviving for a year until the next cargo ship arrives. It means producing from local resources everything the colony population needs to remain alive across generations with no external assistance. Food, water, breathable atmosphere, energy, building materials, medical equipment, electronics. Replacement parts for every single valve, seal, circuit board, sensor, gasket, and structural component in every critical subsystem. It must also sustain a genetically diverse population capable of long-term reproduction without the health consequences of extreme inbreeding. A population large enough and varied enough to remain biologically viable across centuries. Start with the genetics, because this is a constraint most Mars plans never seriously address. Population genetics models vary in their estimates, but most credible analyses place the minimum viable population, the smallest group that can maintain enough genetic diversity to avoid substantial inbreeding depression across multiple generations, somewhere between 500 and several thousand individuals. Some optimistic models allow the number as low as 160, but only under assumptions of active genetic management, tightly controlled reproduction, and periodic supplementation of the gene pool, all of which involve ethical questions no one has resolved. The practical takeaway is that a colony of a few dozen or a few hundred is not viable across generations without ongoing supplementation. And you need thousands, not gradually delivered over decades, but arriving during a period compressed enough that the founding population can carry the full genetic diversity from day one. Because once the gene pool is set, there is no immigration office on Mars. There is no way to introduce new genetic material without an interplanetary launch, and every such launch is a 2-year window. Now consider food production. Growing crops on Mars requires controlled environment agriculture inside sealed, pressurized greenhouses with artificial lighting, temperature regulation, atmospheric management, and soil that has been either imported from Earth at prohibitive cost or manufactured locally from processed Martian regolith. And that regolith, the loose surface material on Mars, contains perchlorates at concentrations lethal to human biology and damaging to most terrestrial plants. Removing the perchlorates at scale requires chemical processing infrastructure that itself has to be built, powered, and maintained by the same colony that is trying to eat. Even in optimized controlled environments with clean soil, crop yields are constrained by available light, water, nutrient supply, atmospheric composition, and volume. Mars receives roughly 43% of the solar flux Earth does at the top of the atmosphere. Supplemental lighting is possible, but it requires electricity, which requires power infrastructure, which requires maintenance, which requires spare parts. Every system connects to every other system. Every subsystem has its own 5 failure modes, each of which requires a maintenance path. Most optimistic estimates for Martian agriculture, worked through in the closed-loop life support literature, suggest that a colony of 1,000 people would require several 100,000 square meters of enclosed, pressurized, temperature-controlled agricultural volume. Several hundred football fields of airtight greenhouses built on a planet with less than 1% Earth surface pressure and an average temperature of -63 degrees Celsius. Constructing, pressurizing, and continuously maintaining that much enclosed volume using materials either shipped from Earth or manufactured locally from processed rock is a construction program that makes the International Space Station, the single most expensive object ever built in the history of human civilization, look like a garden shed. Water on Mars exists primarily as ice in the polar caps and in mid-latitude subsurface deposits. Extracting, purifying, and distributing that water requires mining equipment, thermal processing systems, filtration infrastructure, and a distribution network that must operate continuously in an environment where exposed water either freezes or sublimates within seconds depending on local conditions. None of this is impossible in principle. In principle, humans can do many things. But all of it requires energy, enormous quantities of energy, and on Mars, where solar intensity is less than half of Earth's and where planet-wide dust storms can suppress incoming sunlight to a low haze for weeks or months, energy is not guaranteed. A colony that depends solely on solar generation is a colony that holds its breath every dust storm season. Nuclear fission power is a plausible and probably necessary alternative. But reactors require fuel, shielding, cooling systems, maintenance expertise, and eventual decommissioning capacity, another chain of dependencies that must be established and sustained on a planet where every component has to arrive from Earth or be manufactured on-site under conditions that make industrial production genuinely difficult. The atmosphere is 95% carbon dioxide with essentially no free oxygen. A colony must produce its own oxygen, either through electrolysis of water, which requires substantial electrical energy and specialized high-temperature equipment, or through biological pathways like algal cultivation and cyanobacterial ecosystems, which require closed-loop biology that has never been demonstrated at the scale a human colony would demand. NASA has flown a small oxygen-generating experiment on the Perseverance rover called MOXIE, which demonstrated the direct extraction of oxygen from the Martian carbon dioxide atmosphere via solid oxide electrolysis. MOXIE produced about 10 grams of oxygen per hour at peak. A single human being requires approximately 840 grams of oxygen per day for metabolic respiration. MOXIE, running at full capacity around the clock, could sustain approximately one person for about 1 hour out of every 24. Scaling that to a colony of 1,000 people requires not an incremental improvement, but an industrial-scale oxygen production facility that does not yet exist in any form. The International Space Station is the closest analog we have to a closed-loop life support system, and after more than 25 years of continuous operation, it is not remotely close to self-sustaining. The ISS recycles roughly 93% of its water and generates a fraction of its oxygen through electrolysis, but it depends absolutely on regular resupply missions for food, spare parts, atmospheric gas replenishment, clothing, medical supplies, and hardware upgrades. The single most sophisticated orbital habitat ever built remains fundamentally dependent on Earth for survival. It cannot last more than a few months without a cargo delivery, and the ISS is 400 kilometers away, where resupply is a matter of days. Mars is 200 million kilometers away, and resupply is a matter of years. A self-sustaining Mars colony is not a colony that has all the parts stockpiled before crew arrival. It is a colony that has built from scratch an entire industrial civilization: mining, refining, smelting, manufacturing, chemical processing, agriculture, water treatment, power generation, medical care, education, governance, waste management. Every one of those industries functioning continuously on a planet that is actively hostile to human life in every measurable dimension, with no possibility of quick resupply and no margin for the kind of cascading systemic failure that on Earth we would call a rough decade, and on Mars would be called extinction. No human settlement in the history of the species has ever achieved that level of self-sufficiency, and every isolated community on Earth that people romanticize as a comparison, Polynesian islanders navigating open ocean, Arctic indigenous peoples surviving on ice, remote agrarian societies enduring for generations without outside contact, every one of them depended on their planet's atmosphere, water cycle, functional biosphere, and livable gravity. They breathed air for free. They drank rain. They ate what grew in soil that was already teeming with billions of microorganisms, doing biochemistry the settlers never had to engineer. On Mars, there is no biosphere. There is no water cycle. There is no breathable atmosphere. There is no living soil, there is no survivable weather, there is no food chain to tap into. Everything must be manufactured, everything must be maintained. Everything must work all the time, or people begin to die in numbers that a small population cannot afford. The colony myth is not that Mars is hard. Everyone agrees Mars is hard. The myth is that Mars is an engineering problem, a very difficult version of building a bridge or launching a satellite, something that scales, given enough money and enough talent. It is not. It is a systems of systems problem of a kind humanity has never successfully managed, where every subsystem depends on every other subsystem, where failure in any one cascades through all the rest, and where the margin for error is essentially zero because there is no external support to fall back on. No neighbor to borrow from, no emergency shipment arriving next week, no second chance that arrives on any human timescale. Artemis 2 carried 4 people for 10 days. They did not grow food, they did not mine water, they did not manufacture oxygen. They lived on supplies packed on Earth and consumed on a schedule measured in hours. A self-sustaining Mars colony would require not a vehicle, but an entire civilization built from nothing on a world that offers nothing, with no safety net. That is not a stepping stone. That is a fantasy dressed in engineering vocabulary. Recognizing it as such is not defeatism. It is the beginning of the kind of honesty that might, if we let it, actually lead to progress. Part 17. The cost that nobody is willing to actually pay. The Artemis program, as of the most recent public accounting available at the time of Artemis 2's return, has cost American taxpayers approximately $93 billion. Let that number sit for a moment, $93 billion. That figure includes the development of the Space Launch System, the Orion spacecraft, the ground systems at Kennedy Space Center, the supporting infrastructures spread across NASA field centers and contractor facilities, and the 2 missions flown to date. For that investment, an investment larger than the annual economic output of many mid-sized nations, we have completed 1 uncrewed test flight and 1 crewed flyby, and we are preparing for a lunar landing that is still being scheduled and has already slipped several times. $93 billion. That is roughly the annual gross domestic product of Kenya, a country of about 55 million people. It is more than the combined GDP of dozens of smaller nations. It is more than the entire annual budget of most federal cabinet departments. And it has produced, in terms of demonstrated crewed spaceflight capability, a vehicle system that can send 4 people to lunar distance and return them. If the heat shield performs as it did once, if the space weather cooperates within the specific launch window, and if nothing unexpected fails in a vehicle that has flown exactly 1 crewed mission. That is what $93 billion purchases in the year of Artemis 2. A conditional capability for a short-duration lunar flyby with caveats attached to every critical subsystem. This is not intended as a criticism of NASA or of the engineers doing the work. Developing a crewed deep space vehicle is genuinely materially difficult. The engineering is real. The people are brilliant. But the ratio between investment and demonstrated capability tells you something important about the economics of what comes next. Because the moon is the easy part. A crewed Mars program, not a colony, not a settlement, not a civilization, just a single round-trip mission with a crew of 4 to 6 people, there and back, survive and return, is estimated across most credible cost analyses at somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion. That range depends on the mission architecture, the development timeline, the level of international cost-sharing, and, most critically, the level of risk mitigation built into the safety margins. The lower estimates assume optimistic timelines, heavy reliance on a single launch vehicle system, and risk tolerances that would make most safety officers uncomfortable. The higher estimates assume the redundancy and margin that any responsible risk officer would actually require for a mission with no abort-to-Earth option and no rescue trajectory. The higher estimates are the honest ones, $1 trillion. That is a staggering figure. But the arithmetic makes it more nuanced than it first appears. It is not an impossible number. It is a large number. It is an uncomfortable number. But it is within the reach of a wealthy global civilization. Global military spending in a single recent year exceeded $27 trillion. The combined GDP of the G7 nations exceeds $45 trillion annually. A $1 trillion Mars program, distributed over 25 years, would cost roughly $40 billion per year, less than 5% of annual United States defense spending. The money exists. It is spent on other things. NASA's current budget represents about 0.5% of the total United States federal budget, half of 1%. During the peak of the Apollo program in the mid-1960s, NASA's share was approximately 4.5%, 9 times its current share. And even at that funding level, with the political urgency of the Cold War as motivation, Apollo was not a sustained exploration program. It was a targeted political sprint. Reach the moon before the Soviets, plant the flag, come home, declare victory. From Kennedy's speech to Armstrong's footprint took less than a decade, and the last 3 planned Apollo missions were cancelled almost immediately after the goal was achieved. The Saturn V production line was shut down. The capability to reach the moon was deliberately abandoned because the political will that created it evaporated the moment the geopolitical objective was met. That history matters. It tells you something fundamental about how large-scale space programs actually work. They do not run on engineering, they run on political energy. And political energy is the most volatile fuel humanity produces. It surges during crises and fades the moment the crisis passes. A Mars program cannot survive on that kind of fuel. It is too long. It would require sustained commitment across 5, 6, potentially 7 presidential administrations. It would require Congress to approve escalating budgets year after year for a program whose payoff sits decades away and whose risks are enormous. It would require maintaining public support for a project that produces, for most of its duration, nothing visible. No launches, no landings, only laboratories and test articles and design reviews. The exciting parts arrive at the end. The bills arrive every year. The financial reality is not that Mars is unaffordable. It is that Mars is not prioritizable. And there is a real distinction between those two statements. Unaffordable implies a hard limit that money cannot cross. Not prioritizable implies a choice, a competing set of claims on the same pool of resources. And that choice is not irrational. It is the product of billions of people who still lack clean water, healthcare systems that are underfunded, infrastructure that is crumbling, climate adaptation that requires trillions of dollars of investment over coming decades, and political consequences that reward immediate action on immediate problems and punish long-term investment in delayed payoff projects. In that competitive environment, spending $1 trillion to send 6 people to a planet where they may die, in a mission whose probability of full success is uncomfortably far from certainty, is an extraordinarily difficult political proposition. Not because voters lack imagination, because voters in aggregate are rational. This connects to the central thesis in a way that is often glossed over. We spend most of our discussion time on technical barriers, the radiation, the heat shield, the biology, the logistics. Those barriers are real and formidable. But even if every one of them were solved tomorrow, if some breakthrough in materials science and radiation biology and closed-loop life support handed us a technically viable Mars architecture by next quarter, the funding required to actually implement those solutions would demand a level of sustained political and economic commitment that has no precedent in human history. Apollo is the closest comparison, and Apollo lasted 8 years with 9 times the budget share and a superpower rivalry providing the motivation. Mars would require 25 to 30 years at a fraction of the budget share, with no equivalent geopolitical driver. The arithmetic does not work, not because the money is not there, but because the sustained political will to allocate the money has never existed for any project of this scale and duration, in any country, for any purpose. The cost is not the barrier. The unwillingness to pay the cost, year after year, administration after administration, is the barrier. Part 18. The cooperation that never quite arrives. In 2020, NASA introduced the Artemis Accords, a framework of bilateral agreements establishing principles for the peaceful exploration and use of outer space. By the time of Artemis II, more than 55 nations had signed, ranging from traditional spacefaring powers like Japan, Canada, and the United Kingdom to emerging space nations across South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. It is the largest international framework for space cooperation since the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, itself a Cold War document drafted primarily to prevent nuclear weapons from being placed in orbit. The Artemis Accords represent on paper a genuine step forward, a shared set of principles for how nations should conduct themselves as they expand their activities beyond low Earth orbit. Transparency in operations, notification of activities, interoperability of hardware, guidelines for the extraction and use of space resources. It reads like progress. And in a narrow diplomatic sense, it is progress. But for the purposes of what this video has been building toward, whether humanity can mount the sustained, coordinated multinational effort required to actually put humans on Mars and keep them alive, the Artemis Accords are structurally inadequate. Not because they are badly written. The principles are reasonable. Not because the signatories lack seriousness. Many of them are entirely serious. But because a gentleman's agreement is being asked to carry the weight of a civilization-scale engineering program, and gentlemen's agreements do not build spacecraft. The Accords are not a treaty. This is not a technicality. It is a structural limitation. A treaty under international law carries binding obligations. It can specify enforcement mechanisms, dispute resolution procedures, penalties for non-compliance, and formal withdrawal processes. The Accords have none of these. They are bilateral agreements between each signatory and the United States, and their provisions are aspirational rather than obligatory. No nation that signs the Accords is legally required to contribute funding, share technology, provide launch capacity, or participate in any specific mission. They are agreeing to principles, not commitments. More critically, the Accords do not include China, which operates one of the two most capable space programs in the world and is actively pursuing its own crewed lunar program with a targeted landing before 2030. China has built and operates the Tiangong space station. It has successfully landed rovers on the Moon and Mars. It has demonstrated the full spectrum of capabilities that a Mars mission would require. Any serious international Mars effort that excludes China is missing one of its most capable potential partners. That exclusion is not accidental. It is the direct product of United States legislation, the Wolf Amendment, which prohibits NASA from engaging in bilateral cooperation with China without explicit congressional approval. The concerns motivating that law are not trivial. But the consequence is that the two nations most capable of contributing to a Mars program are legally prevented from cooperating on one. The Accords also do not include Russia, which, despite its declining space infrastructure and the geopolitical isolation following its invasion of Ukraine, retains substantial institutional knowledge, long-duration flight expertise honed across the Mir and ISS programs, and specific research in nuclear thermal propulsion that could meaningfully reduce Mars transit times and thereby reduce crew radiation exposure. Excluding Russia from a Mars effort removes a real knowledge base from the program. What the Accords actually create is a framework of norms among a coalition of nations primarily aligned with the United States geopolitically. That is useful for coordinating lunar surface activities and avoiding operational interference between national programs. It is not sufficient for funding a trillion-dollar Mars program, distributing technical risk across multiple space agencies, or maintaining political alignment across the 25 to 30-year development horizon that Mars demands. The International Space Station is the closest precedent for multinational crewed space cooperation, and its history is instructive in ways that ought to worry anyone planning for Mars. The ISS partnership involving NASA, Roscosmos, ESA, JAXA, and CSA required more than a decade of negotiation before the first module launched in 1998. President Reagan proposed Space Station Freedom in 1984. 14 years of redesigns, budget fights, partner renegotiations, and political upheaval passed before the first component reached orbit. 14 years just to agree on what to build and who would pay for what portion of it. And the ISS is a 400-kilometer commute. It is serviced by multiple launch vehicles from multiple nations on a routine cadence. Crew rotations happen every 6 months. Cargo arrives every few weeks. The risks are real but manageable. Costs, roughly $150 billion across the life of the program, are distributed across 5 agencies and amortized across 3 decades. The ISS partnership has survived geopolitical crises that would have killed lesser collaborations. It survived Columbia. It survived the retirement of the Space Shuttle. It survived the 2014 annexation of Crimea. It survived the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine that led to the near-total collapse of the U.S.-Russian relationship in almost every other domain. Through all of that, cosmonauts and astronauts continue to launch together and live together on the station. That resilience is genuinely remarkable. But the ISS analogy has limits, and those limits matter for Mars. The ISS works because its stakes are manageable. If a partner nation withdraws, the station can be reconfigured. If a supply mission fails, another can be launched within weeks. If a crew member becomes ill, they can be returned to Earth in hours. The entire partnership operates within a safety net of proximity, redundancy, and reversibility. None of those conditions apply to Mars. A Mars program has no redundancy at the mission level. If a critical partner withdraws during development, the program collapses or slips by years. During the mission itself, there is no resupply, no crew swap, no emergency return. The commitment is total and irreversible in a way the ISS has never demanded. Mars requires civilization-scale coordination that humanity has never sustained for any purpose. Climate change, an existential global threat backed by overwhelming scientific consensus, has produced 3 decades of negotiation and rising emissions. Nuclear disarmament, a stated goal of every major power since the 1960s, has produced a reduced but still civilization-ending stockpile. Pandemic prevention, supposed to be the enduring lesson of COVID-19, has already faded from priority lists. Every major global challenge that requires sustained multinational cooperation across decades has either stalled or regressed. We have never sustained a global cooperative project at the scale and duration Mars demands. Not once, not for anything. The political fracture is not a secondary concern that can be resolved after the engineering is figured out. It is load-bearing. Because even if physics fell into place, even if the biology fell into place, the program would still require political continuity across decades, budget stability across administrations, and international trust across active geopolitical fault lines. In a world where administrations change every 4 to 8 years, where funding for basic science is often the first line item cut in austerity budgets, and where the nations most capable of contributing to Mars view each other as strategic rivals, the political infrastructure for Mars simply does not exist. Building it would be at least as difficult as building the rocket. Part 19. The narrative that keeps the dream alive. There is a story about Mars that you have been hearing in one form or another for years. It goes approximately like this. Humanity is destined to become a multi-planetary species. Mars is the next frontier. We will build a city on the red planet within a lifetime. It is not a question of if, only of when. And the leading character in this story, the person whose name is most associated with the popular narrative, is a specific and well-known chief executive of a launch vehicle company. Let me be careful here, because this is a conversation that generates more heat than light in most public forums. The vision of Mars colonization has done something genuinely valuable. It has inspired a generation of engineers, physicists, and biologists to enter fields they might otherwise not have chosen. It has attracted billions of dollars of private capital into launch vehicle development. It has accelerated real progress in reusable rocketry, in mass manufacturing efficiency for aerospace components, and in mission design methodology. The Starship program, whatever you think of its target timeline or its promises, is producing hardware that has genuine applications in satellite deployment, lunar cargo logistics, and space-based infrastructure. But there is a gap between the narrative and the observed reality. And that gap deserves an honest examination, because it is the reason the discussion we have been having in this video has been so difficult to have in public in a serious way. One interpretation held by a number of analysts inside the space industry is that the Mars narrative functions primarily as a funding story, a grand vision that attracts investment, recruits talent, and generates enthusiasm, while the near-term business model actually runs on satellite broadband, government launch contracts, and lunar logistics. Under this interpretation, Mars is not a deception, but it is not an operational plan either. It is an aspirational North Star, and the actual near-term engineering milestones are more modest and more achievable than the headline suggests. Another interpretation is more generous, that the Mars vision is entirely sincere, that the long-term goal is real, and that the public timeline is simply optimistic, as all engineering timelines tend to be, but that the direction is correct even if the arrival date is wrong. The truth is almost certainly some combination of the two, and it is not the purpose of this video to assign motives to individuals. What can be said, based on everything we have walked through, is that the gap between the popular narrative of Mars colonization and the scientific consensus on its feasibility is large, and it is widening, not shrinking. Every year, as our understanding of the deep space radiation environment deepens, as long-duration physiology data accumulates from ISS crews, as the logistical requirements of sustained off-world presence become more clearly quantified, and as material science bumps against the same fundamental limits, the technically honest timeline for a crewed Mars mission moves further out, not closer in. Narrative says a decade or two. The data says we do not know. Has possibly never, without breakthroughs that have not yet occurred and may not occur on any human timescale. The danger of the narrative is not that it inspires people. Inspiration is a good thing. Every generation needs stories that pull them forward. The danger is that the narrative substitutes for strategy. Policymakers, engineers, funders, and the public to believe the problem is being solved, when in fact the foundational obstacles remain almost entirely untouched. Belief in Mars colonization may be driven more by narrative gravity than by demonstrated readiness, and if we are going to take the dream seriously, we have to take the obstacles seriously alongside it. Otherwise, we are not doing engineering, we are doing theater with an engineering vocabulary. Which brings us to the conclusion. To what Artemis 2 actually proved when you strip away the celebration and read only the sensor logs. Art 20. The truth we brought home. Let me walk you through what we now know as a species, in a way we did not fully know 2 months ago. The radiation environment in deep space exceeds any reasonable definition of human survivability limits for a Mars duration mission. We have no material that can shield a crew from galactic cosmic rays without generating secondary radiation. We have no pharmaceutical countermeasure that protects DNA from ionizing radiation in real time at a level relevant to a multi-year mission. We have no active shielding technology deployable on a crewed vehicle. The European Space Agency, in language uncharacteristically direct for a diplomatic body, has stated that a crewed Mars mission is not currently viable due to radiation alone. The heat shield technology validated on Artemis II was a modified configuration that had never previously flown at lunar return velocity with a crew. That configuration itself was a workaround for unexplained ablation failures on the previous uncrewed mission. A Mars return atmospheric entry occurs at 27% higher velocity than a lunar return, producing approximately 8 times the radiative heat flux at the stagnation point. No crewed system has ever been designed for that regime, and no heat shield material has been flight tested at those conditions. The human body degrades in microgravity at rates that compound catastrophically over the 2.5 to 3 year duration of a Mars mission. Bone loss, muscle atrophy, cardiovascular deconditioning, vision impairment, immune suppression. These effects synergize with radiation damage in ways that are poorly understood, and no validated countermeasure exists for multi-year duration. The psychological environment of a Mars mission, total isolation, communication delays of up to 24 minutes each direction, no possibility of rescue, no early return option, has no precedent in human experience, and no validated mitigation strategy for the duration involved. The logistics of sustaining even a small crew on Mars for the required 500-day surface stay require a supply chain of unprecedented complexity. The logistics of sustaining a colony are orders of magnitude beyond that, and the launch cadence required has no analogue in the history of engineering. The political and economic infrastructure required to fund and coordinate a Mars program does not currently exist, and shows no sign of emerging within the timeframes any published mission concept requires. And the physics of atmospheric entry from a Mars return velocities sits in a regime that our current materials cannot address. Every one of these is a hard problem. Some may be solvable with sufficient time, sufficient funding, and sufficient scientific breakthrough. None of them are being solved right now, and several of them, radiation shielding at biologically relevant reduction factors, re-entry physics at Mars return velocity, closed-loop life support at colony scale, are not incrementally improvable. They require qualitative leaps in capability that are not currently on any published development roadmap. Artemis II was not a stepping stone to Mars, it was a diagnostic test. And the diagnosis, honestly read, is this: we are farther from Mars than we were when we started dreaming about it, because we now understand the obstacles in a way we did not before. When Apollo 17 lifted off the lunar surface in December of 1972, there was a sense, retrospectively naive but genuinely felt, that Mars was next. That the Moon was the practice lap and the red planet was the main event. 53 years later, we have returned to the lunar neighborhood, and what we found there was not a launching pad. It was a mirror, a reflection of exactly how far we have not come along the dimensions that would actually matter for going farther. The distinction that matters, and it is the distinction that this channel, the Cosmic Forecast, keeps returning to across every video, is this: we can visit deep space. We might someday, with real breakthroughs, be able to survive it in short doses, but colonize it. Build a civilization, sustain a population, those capabilities are not delayed, they do not exist. And pretending that they exist, or that they are around the corner, is not vision. It is misdirection. I want to be precise about what I am not saying. I am not saying we should stop exploring. I am not saying Artemis is a failure. I am not saying space is a waste of resources. Artemis II was a genuine hard-won achievement. 4 people traveled farther from Earth than any human beings in half a century, and they returned safely. That matters. That is real. But achievement is not the same as its capability. And the narrative that frames Artemis II as a step toward Mars is not supported by the data that Artemis II itself produced. The data says we are barely competent at the Moon. The data says deep space is more hostile than our models had assumed. The data says the human body, the human mind, and our best technology are all operating at their limits on a 10-day mission. And the mission we keep promising, the mission that keeps appearing in every keynote, requires 900. There is photograph the Artemis 2 crew captured during the lunar transit. It shows Earth as a small blue disk against the blackness, reduced by distance to something you could cover with your thumb held at arm's length. That image has been captured before, by Apollo, by Voyager, by every spacecraft that has looked backward. But the Artemis 2 version carries something new. It carries the knowledge of what the crew was experiencing while they looked at it. The radiation alarms that never fully quieted. The heat shield uncertainty that no one aboard could resolve. The solar storms rolling through the space around them. The awareness that every millimeter of vacuum between them and that fragile blue disk was, in ways they had not been fully briefed on, actively trying to kill them. That image is not an invitation to expand. It is a reminder of where we actually live, of the only place in the known universe where a human being can stand outside unprotected and continue to exist. We are not a multiplanetary species. We are not close to becoming one. And the honest reckoning with that fact, the willingness to look at the sensor data and say, not yet, and maybe not ever, unless we do something fundamentally different, is the real beginning of progress. Artemis 2 did not show us how to reach Mars. It showed us how far away we still are from surviving it. Whether the breakthroughs come in materials science, in radiation biology, in closed-loop ecology, in political cooperation, in human resilience, is an open question. Maybe they do. Maybe in 50 years, or 100 or 200, we will look back on this moment and marvel at how limited our thinking was. Or maybe we will look at that photograph of Earth, small and blue and utterly alone, and finally understand what it has been telling us the whole time. That this is it, that this is home, and that taking care of it, seriously, urgently, and with the same engineering rigor we bring to spacecraft, might be the bravest exploration we ever undertake. One last thing before we close this out, because it is the thing that has been sitting in the back of my head across every part of this script. There is a version of this story where the 20 parts you have just heard get filed away as pessimism, as doom-casting, as the kind of contrarian content that gets clicks by tearing down the dream. That is not what this was. I want to be very clear on that, because the cosmic forecast is not in the business of tearing down anything worth building. It is in the business of measuring the actual gap between the story we are being told and the sensor data that is coming back. Sometimes the gap is small. Sometimes, as with Artemis 2, the gap is a canyon. And a canyon does not disappear because we refuse to look into it. It disappears, or at least narrows, only when we map it honestly, mark its edges precisely, and start building the bridges that would actually cross it. That is engineering. Everything else is marketing. So when you leave a comment tonight, when you tell me where in the world you are, what time it is, and what part of this video landed hardest, I want you to also tell me this. If you had to pick one of the walls we have discussed, radiation, heat shield physics, biology, psychology, logistics, funding, cooperation, and dedicate the next 50 years of human ingenuity to demolishing it, which one would you pick? Because that answer, aggregated across thousands of thoughtful people, is where the real Mars program, if there is ever going to be one, actually begins. Not with a launch, with the decision about which wall to hit first. Thank you for staying with me through all 20 parts. This is the Cosmic Forecast. If you found this video worth your time, subscribe so the next one finds you. Leave a comment with your location and your honest reaction. Because I read them, and on this topic, the geography of the answers has been telling a story of its own. And if there was one number, one paragraph, one moment in this video that changed the way you think about Mars, share it. Because the conversation that follows Artemis 2 is going to shape the next 50 years of human spaceflight, and the more people who understand what the data actually says, the better that conversation becomes. Until next time, keep looking up, And keep looking honestly. Because the universe rewards attention and it punishes wishful thinking with patient indifference. Artemis 2 came home. 4 astronauts came home. Everyone is now walking around on the only surface in the universe that will let them do it unassisted. That is the entire thing. And whatever we build next is on the moon, in cislunar space, in low Earth orbit, in the labs where the real Mars work will happen if it happens at all, will be measured not against the fantasy timeline in the keynote decks, but against the numbers those 4 astronauts carried home in the sensor logs of a capsule now resting in a recovery bay in California, waiting to tell us the rest. This is the Cosmic Forecast, signing off.